You're listening to Astonishing Healthcare, the podcast hosted by Judy Health, focusing on the biggest issues affecting healthcare consumers, benefits plan sponsors, and health plans. We're covering how things truly work or don't in the U.S. healthcare system and pharmaceutical supply chain, and we're doing it in an astonishingly efficient way.
Hello, and thanks for listening to this episode of Astonishing Healthcare. I'm Justin Vanieri, your host, and today we're talking about health policy again, specifically the Department of Labor, or DOL's, proposed rules to enhance PBM transparency. I've got Julie Selesnick in the studio with me. She's Executive Director, Legal and Compliance at Judy Group, our independent advisory firm, who has been a guest on the show a couple of times now. But there's a very specific catalyst for this episode, the comments. And that comment period closed for the DOL's proposed rules on April 15th. So now they've got their hands full with hundreds of comments, including your 20-page comment, Julie. Welcome back to the studio.
Thank you, Justin. Happy to be back.
So I saw this on LinkedIn. And I said, why aren't we doing a show on this so that I can ask you to go into a little bit of detail here and explain kind of your guys' perspective collectively on this proposed rule. Before we get into it, for anybody that hasn't heard you on the show or doesn't know you, can you maybe share just a little bit about your background?
Sure. I've been an attorney for about 25 years, specializing in ERISA for well over a decade, focused on health plans specifically. And I've gone from being basically a class action attorney to doing consulting work and advising plans and vendors on how to, be better fiduciaries, minimize litigation risk and regulatory risk, and also make better procurement decisions, because making better procurement decisions is tied to being a better fiduciary, vice versa. So really have transferred from dealing with issues after they happen at litigation to trying to stop them before they happen through better contracting, better RFPs, and just better fiduciary management. And that has led me to Judy Group, which, as you know, launched in January. And at Judy Group, I'm the executive director of legal and compliance, and we're advising, health plans from soup to nuts on how to minimize risk, purchase better, and do all the things in between.
That makes a ton of sense why you're here doing those things and why we're talking about this today. Part of the reason I'm excited to chat with you is because I know you went through a lot of these comments that have come in. And it's cool because there's so much general support out there for PBM reform and improving transparency in the supply chain for health benefits, helping plan fiduciaries do a better job and make better decisions for their plans and for their plan members. But going through the comments, it seemed like there's a lot of, puts and takes, if you will. And I would love to hear from you, your comments specifically. Maybe start off with one or two of the key points. First off, are you pro in general, the proposed rules as they stand? And then where would you say they need to be either enhanced or altered to be more effective?
Great question. So Judy Group, our letter reflects support for the proposed regulations. And to be clear, we applaud the department. These are, excellent set of regulations on a very complicated topic. What we did was try and respond to the questions that were specifically asked by the DOL, where they were seeking additional comment or feedback, and also make sure that we address some areas where we thought that clarification would be helpful or that something may have been missing. And there wasn't much that was missing. So sort of overall, our largest comments were, one, to make sure that it is made clear, even though the department continues to make it clear, a lot of vendors in this space continue to act as if they are not already subject to making these disclosures under the existing 408(b)(2) regulations. And this has been under debate since CAA 2021 because of the words broker and consultant were included at the beginning of sort of each category of vendor. Early on, the DOL released guidance saying this should be interpreted broadly. And if you perform any of these substantive activities, and the activities were things like claim administration, PBM, formulary placement, management, everything that all the vendors to a health plan do, if you do any of that, you should either respond to this or you should be prepared to explain to the department why you didn't think you should respond. That said, only brokers and consultants at first agreed that they had a duty to do this. And I will say, Capital RX, the reason that I got to know you all is because Capital RX was an early adopter of making 408(b)(2) disclosures. That was one of the ways I got to know you all, is that I was hired to help you come up with compliant disclosures. But the vast majority of PBMs and TPAs took the position that doesn't apply to them and continue to take that position. And that's despite several congressional letters that have been issued saying, hey, this was specifically meant to apply to you, until eventually, we get to this place where President Trump issues an executive order and told the department to issue these regulations to increase transparency of PBM compensation. And so these are sort of an enhanced disclosure. And we wanted to make sure it's clear, however, that PBMs, TPAs, and other plan service providers are already subject to 408(b)(2). So while we're waiting for these to be finalized, or no matter what happens, there's already an existing disclosure requirement, and that also goes for other service providers. We also wanted to make sure that if the rule is finalized, that it apply to TPAs as well. These are the same massive companies that we're having the sort of transparency issues with, own the PBMs and the carriers that are doing the third-party administration, and the same issues abound on the medical side as they do on the prescription drug side. We also submitted a comment on the definition of pharmacy benefit management services, just making sure that it was clear that these regulations also apply to all services provided through the plan's medical benefit, so that there wouldn't be a sort of carve-out and all of these currently undisclosed things could still occur on the medical side, and things therefore would begin being shifted to that side, which is what we think would happen if it's not clear. So we think it needs to be made crystal clear that this applies to medical side drugs as well. So those were sort of the main comments we made. Then we wanted to make sure that nothing was missing from the categories of disclosure, and it's very thorough. There's even a catch-all for sort of things that aren't there, but we did include one specific area of sort of drug reclassification, and there's pending litigation on this now, but this is when the pharmacy fills a drug for a plan participant, say they fill it as a brand name drug, and then after the fact, the PBM reclassifies it as a generic and only reimburses the pharmacy as if it was a generic. And so now the plan and the participant have paid brand rates, but the PBM only reimburses at generic level. And the current lawsuit that's pending is by a PBM, but that doesn't mean that this doesn't have a deleterious effect on plan assets too. And that is compensation if that is happening and it's not being returned, so it should be disclosed. We had several other comments as well, but those were sort of the main categories of comments that we submitted.
Gotcha. It's amazing how comprehensive the disclosure requirements appear to be. And I know your comments emphasize that increased PBM transparency. And then I like the concept of applying it to med pharmacy too, because it is such a large amount of spend for plan sponsors. I don't think a lot of people realize how much money is in that bucket.
I just learned last week, sorry to interrupt you, but someone
No.
just told me this and I didn't know this, that supposedly 5 years from now, the medical side drug spend is going to outpace drug spend on the PBM side. That's how quickly it's growing. So I do think it's of critical importance to make sure this applies there, because otherwise we're going to have the same problem on that side as we currently have on this side.
Yeah, that would not be good. Are there specific data disclosure suggestions, or do you think certain data disclosures would meaningfully help change employer or plan sponsor decision making? I think some of the opponents would argue that perhaps there's some administrative burden being introduced here that may be unhelpful in the grand scheme of things. Curious how you kind of balance that with the disclosure requirements, collecting those disclosures, then there's parties making those disclosures, but then the argument like, okay, I got the disclosure now, what do I do with this information, or how do I handle it?
And that's a great question. That is going to be a question that plans have. Okay, now you gave me this. What am I supposed to do now? And obviously, some information is more accessible than others. So, first of all, everyone needs sort of protection, if you're a plan, against being in a prohibited transaction. And that litigation is on the rise. A prohibited transaction is literally any contract with a party in interest, a service provider. So your PBM contract is a prohibited transaction. There's a lower pleading standard now because of a Supreme Court decision last year. Without getting too into the weeds, if a plaintiff says, hey, I paid too much because you're in a prohibited transaction and there's a plausible allegation of paying too much, that's enough. That gets you past a motion to dismiss. So then plans have to be able to defend themselves by responding with the sort of defense to that, which is this is a contract with reasonable provisions and the compensation is reasonable. So the very first thing that needs to happen is that plans need to know what they're they're paying in compensation, and they don't. And that is the truth. The current truth is that most plans cannot say what they are paying a PBM or a TPA in compensation because it's very unclear all of the compensation that exists. And that's because the word compensation isn't the way everyone's thinking of it. It's not like, I mean to pay you this much money. It means every dollar that is being withheld from the plan that arguably would belong to the plan, but is being not passed on to the plan. And so what do I think is the sort of low-hanging fruit? I mean, obviously, plans have to know the total amount in rebates. How do you know that your rebate guarantee is any good if you don't know the total amount? So there's like a basic first question. And on the medical side, I don't know, the vast majority of ASOs, they don't even tell you what the rebates are on the medical side. And they say, we're keeping that. You agree. These are in exchange for administrative fees. And employers have to agree to this without even knowing what it is, or they do agree to this. So problem here, now we do have CAA 2026. And one of the big comments is, but we're moving to a place where rebates have to be 100% pass through. And so good. So for now, the sort of the standard should be disclose all the rebates so we know what the compensation is. And then as soon as they're gone, that any disclosure there should be nil. And if it's not, then there's a problem. But that sort of can stand as a verifier because plans do have to verify compensation. And so they'll be able to verify it by showing that there are no rebates, that they're in a rebate-free model. So the idea that like, oh, this should be put off. And this is one of the common comments as well is, hey, if you're going to do this, they should calibrate with CAA 26 new disclosure regs and not be in effect for 30 months. Well, I mean, plans have been waiting for PBM disclosures since the CAA 2021 went into effect. The idea that we should wait 30 more months for something that should have been being provided for years now seems absurd to me. And I don't see the administrative burden in many of these categories of disclosing it now. Obviously, PBMs know what the rebates are. And they are already reporting this in RxDC reporting. What they're saying is they don't want to do it on the plan level. And I'm sure they don't, but that's the law. That's the rule. And that's the compensation that they're receiving. So it has to be on the plan level. And in fact, plans are supposed to know this. They cannot be a proper fiduciary without knowing. So I don't think that's a very good argument, that one. I think there are other sort of lines that are pretty easily disclosable right now, too. Certainly clawbacks, any sort of things that are coming back from the pharmacy, the reclassification fees that we're talking about. And then, the indirect types of compensation, fees they're getting. There's a lot of talk about manufacturers' fees. And I saw in a lot of the comment letters, the comments saying, well, that has nothing to do with the plan, though. That's for other stuff. Well, if it is, and it really has nothing to do with plan dollars, then it wouldn't come into effect. But if it has something to do with related to that plan, then it has to be disclosed. I mean, that's just, I don't know what they would be doing for a manufacturer that didn't relate to buying drugs for a plan. And so maybe there just needs to be further explanation for how there could be compensation that isn't related to the plan. And if there is a reasonable explanation, then fine, don't include it. But otherwise, even if it's indirect, if it relates to something that has to do with providing drugs to the plan, then it has to be disclosed.
Okay. And then just kind of a twist of a question for you, because it seems like the PBM industry, the traditional PBMs, the big vertically integrated players have always been able to stay a step ahead. Do you think there are any potentially significant unintended consequences that you can foresee if the DOL implements these rules as written, particularly regarding formulary design, rebate structures, patient access? How should policymakers potentially mitigate those risks?
So again, I think we tried to point out the gaps that we saw that could happen where things could get transferred into in our letter, which would be medical side, making sure it applies on the medical side, making sure that every category is sort of accounted for. I think a lot of the comments sort of suggest there's going to be a big cost associated that's going to get passed off to the plans. And, I think plans really have to consider whether or not multi-billion-dollar corporations that should have been disclosing this all along under the law, if they want to continue to do business with, these massive companies, if they're going to pass these costs off to them entirely. I mean, at a certain point, especially on the PBM side, it's not like the TPA side. There are options. There are already options to use a transparent PBM that will disclose this type of stuff and not really cry about it. And so the idea that now if you stick with one of these major PBMs, you're going to pay the price for any sort of, regulatory changes they have to make to comply with law that's been the law. That sort of, it doesn't sit well with me. And also, at least for ESI and Caremark, and pretty soon for Optum, not yet, though I'm not sure what's going on, but those two have agreed with the FTC to create this standard offering that's basically going to be modeled on 100% rebate pass through, no spread pricing. And so if that's happening anyways, it's hard for me to understand the huge regulatory burden associated with disclosing your spread pricing. You know what the spread is because that's your profit. And so it's not like this number doesn't exist somewhere. And that's how I'm pretty sure almost all of these numbers are for the PBMs, is that these numbers exist because these are the profits. And it's hard to imagine that a publicly traded corporation doesn't know where the profit centers are. Now, the one place where I do think there might be hard for plans is getting drug-specific disclosures. That seems like a lot of drugs and a lot of specificity. And I would hate to see employers in a position where they're now supposed to go through every single drug on their formulary and have to determine whether or not this is the right deal for the plan. And I mean, that would be a full-time job inside of another full-time job. And that is
And
definitely a little too much into the minutia for what health plan fiduciaries are able to do, especially for smaller and mid-sized businesses.
that was actually my next question, is that smaller businesses and even smaller PBMs and other stakeholders that have to potentially comply with this, do you see ways or help for them on the way in terms of managing the exposure to these rules?
Yeah. So I think that, again, a lot of what is requested is probably not the heavy lift that the letter suggests it is. I think it's already probably pretty easy to push a button to run a report on your spread, on your rebates, total rebates. I mean, these are things that are already reported in places, just
Yeah.
not to the employer. The places where I think it's more difficult when it comes to drug level disclosure or certain plan level disclosures that would be burdensome both to create and to review. I have seen a lot of suggestions for some sort of machine readable file disclosure. And I don't know, I would need to hear more and see an actual concrete proposal for how that would work. But again, one thing that I do like about the idea of some sort of machine readable file disclosure is it's benchmarkable. And that is ultimately where this industry needs to head. It's even once you figure out what you're paying, we're still in an environment where a lot of the times it's very difficult to know if that's reasonable or not because you have nothing to compare it against. And so what may seem reasonable might be outrageous, or what may seem outrageous to you might be like bottom of the barrel pricing. So we need to be able to compare to something, and creating certain standardized machine readable files in same formats that can be compared seems like a really good idea to me.
That makes a ton of sense. I was nodding along with you there. You mentioned the CAA 2026, this rule, and of course you brought up the FTC versus two of the larger traditional PBMs. With all the disclosure requirements, could you see this becoming the overarching rule or taking the place of like RxDC down the road, or like how,
Oh,
because it seems like there's a lot of repetitive things that stakeholders have to deal with baked into this. I don't know that I saw anybody call that out in the comments specifically, but I know there's a bunch of different comments about like what will be the ultimate rule you have to adhere to.
so one thing here is now if you make these sort of individual level disclosures that are required, RxDC reporting gets a whole lot easier. There's no more having to do it on the sort of aggregate level because every plan will easily have access to this information. And it's really not rocket science, to fill out the D1 through D8. The question is, do you have the information you need to do it? And so probably there will be a lot of brokers or other sort of types of service providers that help plans with their compliance requirements that will be able to step into that role. And PBMs won't really have to do this for their self-funded plans any longer. And if they do, they could potentially charge a fee for it, because it's an added extra. So that's sort of, I do think RxDC reporting, it's for a different purpose, and it's supposed to sort of help CMS figure out what drugs are driving the trend and where the biggest spend is happening. 2 years from now, though, some of those columns can also melt away because there's not going to be rebates allowed any longer. That model is, at least if CAA 2026 stays the way it is now, there won't be rebates anymore in future models after August 30th, 2028. And so, or I guess 30 months. I don't know if that's January 1, 2029, August.
Almost 3 years.
Yeah. So at some point in a few years,
Yep.
there all rebates will have to be passed through. And so you're not going to have to report on rebates. That gets rid of the two most complicated columns right now. And things are going to get a lot easier. Also, if plans are getting this automatic reporting, it should be the click of a button to fill out the other one. So it should simplify existing reporting, not make it more difficult. And anything duplicative should fall away, and a lot of things become unnecessary, and those can get eliminated. So, instead of seeing it as adding to the burden, we should look at where it lessens the burden and where it lightens the regulatory load.
All right, Julie, last question. And I ask everybody, I really thank you for coming on. I know you're busy and sharing your thoughts on the proposed rule and all the comments that you've gone through. What would you say, and of course, keep your compliance hat on, is the most astonishing thing you read? And you mentioned some of them being funny. Tell us a good story. Did something make you sit down on your fainting couch as you were reading these comments?
Well, I took to my fainting couch a few times when I read some of the comments from some of the largest PBMs, the 80% market share PBM. I was surprised at how concerned they are for the plan fiduciaries. And, that was really where the concerns lay, not for their own business model, but for the plans. And how are they going to comply with this? And I don't often get that feeling when I represent the plan. So I did find that surprising. But I was also pleased to see they were all very much in favor of transparency. They just have different ideas of how to get there. I did take to my fainting couch that they all seem to think that this exceeds what the executive branch wants, and that President Trump wouldn't want this because he wants administrative ease and he wants these peeled back. And I'm not sure they all know that these regulations were issued specifically pursuant to an executive order, and I thought that that might be useful information. I also found it very surprising that so many of them thought that Congress never intended for the DOL to go this far and to issue regs like this. And the CAA 2026 makes that clear. And I think that one of the comment letters was from the Minority Committee on the House Education and Workforce Committee, which is the committee that passes the PBM legislation that we're talking about. And they thought that these were great and that they should just go further than they go. So I think that sort of undercuts the idea that Congress would think this exceeded what they intended. I don't think any of the governmental arguments stand up to what actually is happening. President Trump asked for these by an executive order. Congress has clarified that they want the compensation disclosures to include PBMs and have multiple times asked for additional regulations to make sure that these disclosures were happening. And I think that the current proposed rule does everything that the department was asked to do. And whether or not it needs to be simplified or streamlined in a few places, I mean, they're complicated. They probably do. And hearing from all the stakeholders will hopefully help at least come up with a few areas where it won't be overly burdensome to the people that have to make these productions and to the people that have to review these productions. So anything that makes it easier for plans, I'm 100% in favor of, because the last thing plans need is another complicated thing to have to figure out how to comply with. But plans do actually want to know what they're paying service providers. And so I think that to the extent these go a long way in helping make that happen, I'm fully supportive of them.
You really got me thinking as you were talking there that there's so much support for this. And as this goes forward, it might make some of the state level legislation a little stickier or kind of easier to get through, especially in some of the areas where it is requiring people to do things where they just really don't want to do them. It's like a perfect storm for regulation at the federal and state level. Is that a fair takeaway?
I think it's a great takeaway. And, there's just a ton of state activity in PBMs. They want to do more than currently exists. And always the risk is, oh gosh, are we going to get a preemption challenge?
Mhm.
So here you have all of a sudden a lot of areas between these regs, CAA 2026 and the FTC settlement, where it looks like, well, how can this be preempted? These are compatible. These go together. These reinforce one another. And really, if you look, unfortunately, I think a lot of plans believe everything's preempted. States can't make any laws, and that becomes the sort of skittish fallback. But as long as the law doesn't interfere with or restrict an ERISA right, then it's okay. So really what you see get struck down now are laws that sort of force a plan sponsor to do something that might require the plan to be administered different across different states, or might require things that cost more. Like you see getting struck down all the time, these any willing pharmacy provisions. And that's because plans should have a right to steer and tier and restrict and do things like that. But what we're talking about here, helping a plan understand what they're paying, states are already passing this. So far, none have been struck down, but clarifying on the federal level that ERISA requires this is going to go a long way in making sure that these state laws don't get challenged and that any state law that's passed in furtherance of it buttresses and helps enhance these requirements, but doesn't cut against them.
Things are certainly changing rapidly. So
Big
thanks
time.
again. Thanks again, Julie, for coming on the show. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Astonishing Healthcare. Head over to judy.health and visit the Insights section for show notes and other relevant content. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And definitely share the link to this show with your network. Have a great rest of your day.